Hello, my dear friend. Welcome to tonight's gentle journey. My name is Tony, and it is my deepest joy to guide you into a place where time slows down and the weight of the world gently fades away. If this is your first time joining me, you are so very welcome, like a traveler finding a warm hearth on a cool night. And if you've been here before, I'm so glad to see you again, like a friend returning home after a long journey. Your presence here, right now, fills this moment with warmth. I am so grateful for every breath we share tonight. I'm going to tell you a story both eerie and intriguing, a story filled with mystery, with a strange and eerie twist of fate that invites us to reflect on our desires, our choices, and the fine line between what we wish for and what we truly need. Before we dive into tonight's tale, take a moment to settle in. If you're enjoying these stories, please remember to like and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep creating stories that soothe and captivate, taking you on peaceful journeys night after night. And please don't forget to leave a comment below with your thoughts. Your feedback is a treasure helping us grow and improve. Tonight, we are going to visit a small, quiet village. A village where the days are slow and simple, where time stretches its arms in an almost lazy manner. But even in such peaceful places, there are secrets, things hidden beneath the surface just waiting to be uncovered. The story begins with a family, a father, a mother, and their son, living their lives in calm isolation, unaware that one fateful night will change everything. A visitor arrives, a stranger whose tales will draw them into a web of mysteries far deeper than they can imagine. And it all starts with an object, a mysterious, strange object, a monkey's paw. Before we begin, let's take a moment to relax. Close your eyes if you haven't already. Feel your body, settle your muscles softening as the world outside fades. Take a deep breath now, breathing in the stillness of the night. And as you exhale, let go of any worries, any tension. Just release it like the wind carrying away the weight of the day. Feel your body sink deeper, heavier into the surface beneath you. Each breath slow and steady, in and out. Now you're here, ready to listen, ready to drift into the world of the story. So let's begin. Part 1. The Quiet Village. It was a quiet evening, much like any other, in a small cottage at the edge of a sleepy village. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting long shadows on the walls, as a gentle breeze swept through the trees, outside rustling the leaves like whispers of a forgotten time. Inside, the White family sat enjoying the simple comforts of home. There was Mr. White, a man of calm demeanor, his face weathered by the years, but kind. His wife, Mrs. White, sat by the fire, her hands knitting quietly, her face soft and content. And the son Herbert sat beside them, his laugh light and carefree, filling the room with a warmth that could only come from youthful energy. They lived a simple life, peaceful and unhurried. The days seemed to stretch on forever, and yet in that stillness, there was a certain beauty, something serene, untouched by the troubles of the outside world. It was a place where time felt like it slowed, where nothing too dramatic ever seemed to happen, and the world felt perfectly in balance. But sometimes the quietest places hide the most powerful secrets. One evening, as the fire began to dim, there was a knock at the door. It was late, and visitors were rare at this hour. White rose from his chair, wondering who could be visiting at such an odd time. He opened the door to find a stranger standing on the doorstep. A man with a weather-beaten coat, a hat tipped low over his eyes, and a mysterious air about him. "I'm sorry to disturb you at this hour," the stranger said, his voice rough but polite. "But I've been traveling for days, and I need a place to rest." Mr. White, ever the kind soul, invited the man inside. He seemed harmless enough, though there was something about his eyes, a hint of something deeper, something shadowed that unsettled him. Nonetheless, the family welcomed the stranger, offering him warmth and food. The man introduced himself as Sergeant Major Morris, a former soldier who had traveled the world. He spoke of distant lands, strange people and adventures that seemed almost too extraordinary to be true. But it wasn't just the tales of far-off places that captivated the Whites. It was the object he carried with him, an object that seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. "I come bearing a gift," Morris said, his voice lowering. He reached into his coat and produced a small, shriveled object. It was an old, withered monkey's paw, its once curled fingers now stiff and brittle. The family stared at the paw, intrigued yet unsure. The man continued, his tone serious now. "This is no ordinary object," he explained. "It has the power to grant 3 wishes. 3 wishes, but at a price." "It's not a gift you take lightly," Mrs. White laughed nervously. "3 wishes, you say? But Sergeant Major, that sounds like something out of a fairy tale." The man's eyes darkened. "I'm telling you this because you must understand. This is not a game. It's a powerful thing, and it has caused harm in more ways than one. Use it, and you will pay for it." The family fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Morris placed the paw on the table, and for a long moment no one spoke. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the wind howled softly outside, as if to warn them of the danger ahead. Finally, Morris rose to leave. "I've said my piece, I've warned you, now you must decide for yourselves." As the door closed behind him, the family sat in stunned silence, the monkey's paw lying before them, its twisted fingers still. No one knew exactly why, but the air in the room felt heavier now, as though the very space between them had shifted. The words of Sergeant Major Morris echoed in their minds. "Use it and you will pay." And just like that, the course of their lives was about to change forever. Part 2. The First Wish. The fire in the hearth had begun to die down, casting long, flickering shadows across the room. The monkey's paw lay in the center of the table, its twisted, withered fingers staring back at the Whites as though daring them to make a choice. Mrs. White, her face lit by the soft glow of the fire, reached out tentatively, her fingers brushing against the paw. For a moment, no one spoke. The air felt thick, as though the entire room were holding its breath. Herbert, who had been unusually quiet, leaned in, his curiosity getting the better of him. "What would you wish for, Father?" he asked playfully, nudging his father's arm. Mr. White hesitated, his eyes flicking from the paw to his son's eager face. The warning from Sergeant Major Morris still lingered in his mind, the words echoing in the quiet space. "It's not a gift you take lightly, But the temptation was there, creeping into the corners of his thoughts. After all, what harm could one wish do? Surely it couldn't be as dangerous as the soldier had made it seem. Well, I suppose if I were to make a wish, it would be for a bit more money. Mr. White said, his voice hesitant but tinged with amusement. It would certainly make things easier for us, wouldn't it? Mrs. White, still staring at the paw, felt a strange warmth rise in her chest. At the thought, she had never openly said it, but the financial difficulties they had been facing over the years had weighed heavily on her heart. Perhaps this was the chance she had been waiting for. The temptation, like an invisible thread, was pulling her in. Herbert laughed lightly, sensing his father's uncertainty. "Come on, Dad, it's just a bit of fun. A wish for a little extra money to make life easier. What's the harm in that?" Mr. White, feeling a sudden urge to take a chance, picked up the paw, its weight surprisingly heavy in his hand. The room seemed to grow colder as he did so, though the fire still burned brightly. There was a strange, unexplainable pull, a sense that something was about to happen, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the eyes of his wife and son upon him, their expectations hanging in the air. He could feel the warmth of the fire, the weight of the paw, and the strange anticipation building within him. It felt almost like an unspoken agreement the family had been struggling for so long, and now it seemed that the chance to change their fortunes had finally come. He took a deep breath, and before he could reconsider, he whispered, "I wish for 200 pounds. The words hung in the air, their finality settling over the room like a heavy cloak. For a moment, nothing happened. There was no flash of light, no booming sound, only the quiet crackle of the fire and the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. It was as if nothing had changed at all. Mrs. White, her eyes wide with hope, looked at her husband. "Is that it?" she asked softly, a hint of disbelief in her voice. "Did it work?" Herbert shrugged as if to say, "It didn't matter. We'll see in the morning," he said clearly, skeptical, but trying to mask it with a casual smile. But that night, as the family sat in silence, the room feeling colder than before, no one spoke. The weight of the wish lingered in the air like a shadow they couldn't escape. The hours seemed to stretch on, each one heavier than the last. It was as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to change, something to happen. Finally, they went to bed, each of them lying awake in their own way, wondering if they had been foolish, wondering if they had made a mistake. The monkey's paw still lay on the table, untouched, its presence now, a strange invisible weight that hung in the air. The next morning, the sun rose over the village, casting a soft golden light through the windows of the cottage. The family stirred groggy from their restless sleep, unaware that their fate had already begun to shift. Herbert was the first to rise, stretching and yawning, his footsteps light as he made his way to the kitchen. The room was still and quiet, the fire having long since died down to a smoldering glow. Mrs. White followed him, her thoughts still lingering on the wish made the night before. As the morning unfolded, there was no immediate sign of anything unusual. Breakfast was quiet, and the day began much like any other, with the simple rhythms of life continuing as they always had. But then just before noon, a knock came at the door. White opened the door expecting to find a neighbor or perhaps a delivery, but instead he was greeted by a man, dressed in a somber suit, his expression grave. "I'm terribly sorry to bother you at this hour," the man said, his voice low. "But I bring unfortunate news." Mrs. White's heart skipped a beat as she looked at her husband. A sense of unease began to settle over her. The man paused clearly, struggling with the weight of his words. "Your son? Herbert? There was an accident at the factory. I regret to inform you that he's been killed." The world seemed to tilt. Mrs. White's hand flew to her mouth in disbelief. Her husband staggered backward, his face pale. Herbert, her precious son, had been taken in an instant. "The company," the man continued, his voice softer, "now wants to offer you compensation. A payment of £200 as a result of the accident. I'm so very sorry for your loss, Mr." White stood there, his heart pounding in his chest. The wish, the £200, it was the same amount he had wished for. In an instant, the room seemed to close in around them. The weight of the wish and the cost of it pressed heavily on their hearts. The terrible, undeniable truth began to settle over them like a heavy fog. Herbert's life had been exchanged for the very amount of money they had so desperately wished for. Part 3. The second wish. The room felt colder, despite the warmth of the midday sun streaming through the windows. The air was thick with silence, each of them caught in the weight of the tragic news they had just received. The man who had delivered the message had left his words still echoing in their ears. Herbert, their beloved son, was gone. The money they had wished for, the money they had thought would solve their problems, now seemed like a cruel joke, an impossible price for a life. Mrs. White stood by the window, her hands pressed against the cool glass, staring out at the quiet village beyond. She couldn't seem to grasp the truth. How could it be? How could their son, their precious son, be gone? It was as though the world had spun out of control in a single terrible moment. White sat at the table, his hands shaking as he held the monkey's paw in front of him. The paw that had granted them the one wish that had cost them everything. The weight of it was almost unbearable in his hands. He could feel the presence of the paw, its power still pulsing, still waiting as though mocking their sorrow. Mrs. White turned from the window, her eyes red from tears. Her voice was low, barely a whisper, but it held the desperation that had taken root in her heart. "We can't let him go like this, we can't. There has to be something we can do." She stepped toward the table, her eyes fixed on the monkey's paw. "The wish. It can bring him back. We can make another wish, can't we?" Mr. White flinched as though struck. "We can't," he muttered. His voice cracked, the grief too heavy to bear. "We can't do this. The paw, it brought us nothing but pain." But Mrs. White was undeterred. Her face was filled with a frantic hope, the kind of hope that only comes from a mother's love, a love so powerful that it can blind a person to reason. "I don't care what it costs. I want our son back. Please, let's use the paw again. I don't care about the consequences. We can't leave him in that grave." Her words hung in the air, the weight of them suffocating. Mr. White looked at her, his mind racing with the implications. He had already seen the cost of their first wish, the price they had paid for their greed. He had felt the cold grip of fate close around them when the money had arrived, only to realize that it had come at the cost of his son's life. But his wife's plea broke through the walls of his fear, and for a moment he was torn. Could he risk it? Could he make another wish, knowing what he had learned? The thought of seeing Herbert again, of holding him in his arms, was almost too tempting to resist. He glanced at the paw, its twisted fingers beckoning him, offering a second chance, a chance to undo the unimaginable loss they had just endured. "Please, please, let's do it," Mrs. White insisted, her voice rising in urgency. "He's our son. We can't leave him there, buried in the ground." "Please," Mr. White hesitated, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He thought of Sergeant Major Morris's warnings, of the terrible consequences that had followed the first wish, and yet the need to undo the tragedy, the need to see their son alive again, seemed to overpower every rational thought. Finally, with a shaky breath, he reached for the paw. "All right," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "But we must be careful this time. We must be sure." Mrs. White clung to his arm, her eyes pleading with him. The grief in her face was so raw, so desperate, that Mr. White knew there was no turning back now. With trembling hands, he held the paw once more. The air around them seemed to grow heavier, as though the room itself were holding its breath. Mrs. White's voice was barely a murmur as she spoke. I wish my son Herbert would come back to us." The words seemed to hang in the air, their weight settling over the room. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating, as though the world had paused in that moment. The wind outside had stopped, and the fire in the hearth seemed to burn more quietly, as if it too were waiting. For a long while nothing happened. The paw lay still in Mr. White's hand, its twisted fingers unmoving. The house was silent, as though the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for the consequences of the wish to unfold. Then a faint sound broke the silence. It was a soft scratching, distant but distinct, like the sound of fingers scraping against wood. Mrs. White's eyes widened in shock. "What is that?" she whispered, her breath catching in her throat. The sound grew louder, closer, a faint knock at the door. Gentle at first, but steadily growing more insistent. Mr. White's heart raced. Could it be? Was it really their son? The knocking continued now, clearly audible. A desperate, frantic knocking. Mrs. White jumped to her feet, her face pale, her body trembling. It's him. It's Herbert. He's come back. But Mr. White stood frozen, his body stiff with fear. The scratching at the door was becoming more frantic, more insistent, as if someone or something was trying to break in. But it wasn't the soft, familiar knock of their son's hand. It was something else. Mrs. White was already halfway to the door, her hand reaching for the handle. "I can't wait anymore. I need to see him." Her voice trembled with both fear and joy. "Stop!" Mr. White's voice broke through the tension, his hand grabbing her arm. "We don't know what's on the other side of that door," but it was too late. With a frantic cry, Mrs. White threw open the door. Standing in the doorway was not their son. What they saw instead was a figure, twisted and disfigured, a dark shadow of the son they once knew. The figure was not alive, not fully. It was a shell, a husk, a mere echo of what Herbert had been. A cold wave of dread washed over them. Mrs. White stepped back in horror, her heart racing. What had they done? And then, as the shadow of the sun reached toward them, a final realization hit that the price of their wish was about to reveal itself. Part 4: The Return of the Forgotten. The door creaked open slowly, the sound echoing through the quiet room as Mrs. White stepped back, her heart pounding in her chest. She stood frozen in the doorway, her breath caught in her throat. What stood before her was not her son, at least not the boy she had last seen, full of life, full of promise. The figure in the doorway was a shadow of Herbert, a grotesque and twisted echo of the son they had lost. The creature, if it could be called that, was hunched over, its movements stiff and unnatural, as though it could barely contain the agony that pulsed through its broken body. Its eyes were hollow dark pools sunken deep into its face, and its skin, pale gray and stretched too tight over its bones, seemed to shimmer unnaturally in the faint light of the house. Herbert, Miss White whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. She reached toward him, her hands shaking, but something held her back. The air around them had turned cold, and the familiar warmth of the fire in the hearth seemed to retreat into the shadows. The figure did not speak, but its head tilted toward her, the motion jerky as though the limbs were not its own. It reached out with its hands' long bony fingers, distorted and pale, grasping at the air, as if it was searching for something or someone. Herbert, Miss White's voice broke, a sob escaping her throat. She took a step forward, her body trembling, her heart aching with the desire to hold him, to embrace him, and feel him breathe again. But deep inside, something gnawed at her, something telling her that this was not the son she had lost. This was something else. Mr. White stood behind her, his face pale as he looked at the figure. His mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. The wish, the consequences, but nothing made sense. This wasn't their son, and yet it was. He could feel it in the air. It was Herbert's presence, but not the way it should have been. "What have we done, Mr. White?" whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure's arms twitched violently, and it stumbled forward, dragging its feet like a marionette controlled by unseen strings. Its face was twisted in pain, as though it was trying to speak, but no words came. Just the horrific sound of labored breathing and an eerie rattling noise that filled the room. Herbert, Miss White gasped again, reaching out toward him. But Mr. White's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist, holding her back. His grip was firm, desperate. He could not let her touch the creature, not yet. "Not like this, don't he?" said his voice, shaking with a quiet terror. "It's not him, it's not our son." The figure let out a low guttural sound like a moan of pain. It moved closer, its eyes locked onto Mrs. White's, as if trying to make some kind of connection. Some desperate, impossible link to the life it once had. Mrs. White's chest tightened. The sight of it, the thing standing before her, resembling her son, yet so terribly wrong, was unbearable, but she couldn't let go. She couldn't accept that this was all there was. She had wished for her son to return. She had prayed for him to come back to her. And now, here he was, standing in front of her, even if in this twisted form. No, she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. "This is my son. This is him I won't, mister." White pulled her back, his heart pounding as he tried to make sense of what was happening. "It's not him. Don't you see?" he pleaded. "The wish, it's not what we thought. It's not the same. Look at him. This is not the boy we lost, not the boy we loved." Mrs. White jerked away from him, her eyes wild, full of grief and desperation. "It's him. I know it's him. It must be. He's here. He's back," she cried, her hands trembling as she reached for him again. But Mr. White could see it now, the grotesque way the creature moved, the unnatural stiffness in its limbs. The eyes, those eyes empty, hollow, not the vibrant blue that had once sparkled with life. It was as though the boy he had known was lost in a shadow, a dark reflection of what had once been. The room was filled with a suffocating silence. Outside the wind howled, but inside the house was still too still. It felt as if time itself had stopped the world outside, cutting off from the family, leaving them alone in this nightmare. The figure, Herbert or whatever it had become, reached out again, but this time Mr. White stepped in front of Mrs. White, blocking her from its grasp. "No," he said, his voice low but firm. "We must make it stop. We can't let it continue like this." Mrs. White didn't seem to hear him. She was too far gone in her grief, her mind clouded by the unbearable desire to have her son back. She didn't care how it had happened, didn't care what it would cost. She just wanted him. Her heart screamed for him. "Herbert," she whispered again, taking a trembling step toward the creature. "Come to me." Mr. White grabbed her by the shoulders, his voice now shaking with fear and desperation. "You don't understand. This isn't the life we wanted. This isn't what we wished for." But Miss White could not hear him anymore. She was beyond reason, beyond the warnings that he had tried to give. She moved closer to the figure, her eyes locked onto it with a kind of madness. And then, as if in response, the figure jerked violently, its body trembling with a horrible, unnatural force. It reached forward with a sudden, terrifying motion, its hands stretching toward Mrs. White, its mouth open, releasing a sound that was not human. A wail, a terrible cry of agony and despair that echoed through the walls of the house. The sound was enough to snap Mrs. White back to reality. She staggered back, her heart pounding in her chest as she looked at the creature before her. What had they done? What had they awakened? And just like that, the truth was undeniable. Part 5. The Final Wish. The figure in the doorway trembled, its movements jerky and erratic. Miss White, her heart racing, could not tear her eyes away from it. Her son, or whatever this thing had become, was standing before her. But it wasn't him. Not really. The once vibrant boy full of life had been replaced by something that looked like him only in the faintest, most disturbing way. The hollow eyes, the twisted limbs, the twisted grimace-like expression. It was clear that this wasn't the reunion she'd hoped for. She reached out toward him once more, her hand shaking with a mixture of love and desperation. "Herbert, my son." Her voice was barely more than a whisper, barely audible over the sickening wail that now filled the room. But as she reached for him, the creature recoiled. It stepped back, its body twitching as though it had been struck by some invisible force. And then it began to speak, not in words but in sounds, low and guttural, like the rasping of something ancient, something from the depths of the earth. Mr. White watched horror creeping across his face as he realized that it wasn't just the physical transformation that had changed his son. It was something deeper, something more insidious. He had made a terrible mistake. They had made a terrible mistake. The wish had not brought back the Herbert they knew. It had brought back a hollow, twisted version of him, a mockery of the life they had loved. The creature's breath was ragged, each inhale more painful than the last. The air in the room grew colder, heavier. It was as though the very walls of the house were closing in, trapping them in this nightmare they had unleashed. And then through the thick fog of grief and despair, Mr. White heard his wife's voice, trembling but determined. "Make it stop, John. Make it stop. I don't care what it takes. I want my son back. We can't leave him like this." He turned to her, his face pale, his body shaken with fear. "We don't understand what we're doing. We've already made 2 wishes, and look at the cost. What if there's nothing left after the 3rd? But Mrs. White's eyes were wild with grief, her hands trembling as she reached for the monkey's paw. "I don't care. I don't care about the cost anymore. We can't let this be the way we remember him. I won't let him stay like this." The paw was still in his hand. It was warm to the touch, as though the very magic of it pulsed through his fingers, waiting to be used again. The last wish, the final wish. He hesitated, the weight of what he was about to do settling like lead in his chest. This wasn't the life they had wanted. This wasn't the boy they had lost. And yet he knew that his wife's pain, the unbearable longing to hold her son again, was too much for her to bear. She had to believe even now that this could be fixed. Mr. White closed his eyes, steadying his breath. The room was filled with a suffocating silence, broken only by the tortured rasping of the creature. Time seemed to stretch each second, pulling at his mind, each heartbeat more frantic than the last. He felt like he was standing at the edge of something dark, something irreversible. Finally, with trembling hand, he raised the paw, his voice breaking as he whispered, I wish for Herbert to be at peace." The words hung in the air, their meaning heavy and final. There was no turning back now. The last wish had been made. At first, nothing happened. The room was still the figure in the doorway, frozen in its twisted, unnatural stance. Mrs. White's eyes filled with disbelief as she looked at her husband, her lips trembling with confusion and fear. "What's happening?" she whispered. "Why isn't he?" And then slowly, the air began to change. The room grew warmer, the cold chill that had gripped them dissipating. The figure in the doorway seemed to waver, its form blurring as if it were being pulled away by an unseen force. The horrible, guttural breathing softened, fading into silence. Mrs. White took a cautious step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached out again, but before she could touch the figure, it crumbled, falling to the floor in a heap, leaving nothing but stillness in its wake. The house was silent. For a long time, neither Mr. White nor Mrs. White moved. Their eyes were fixed on the place where their son had stood moments ago, but now there was only emptiness. The figure was gone, disappeared, as if it had never been there at all. And in the silence that followed, a strange peace settled over them. The monkey's paw, still gripped tightly in Mr. White's hand, seemed to lose its power, as though the final wish had released its grip on them. No more wishes, no more desire to change fate. The tragedy had been undone. But at what cost? Mrs. White collapsed into her husband's arms, sobbing quietly. The weight of what they had done, the price they had paid for their selfish desire, was too much to bear. They had wanted their son back, but they hadn't understood the price. They hadn't understood the consequences of tampering with fate. The house, once filled with hope, now stood silent, cold, and empty. And in the quiet, they both realized that some things are better left untouched. Some wishes once made can never be undone. The past cannot be rewritten, and the future cannot be changed. And as they stood there, holding each other in the stillness, they knew that their lives would never be the same again. Part 6. The Aftermath. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. The walls that had echoed with laughter, the floors that had known the soft footsteps of a child, now seemed to close in around Mr. and Mrs. White. The air was thick with a heaviness. They couldn't shake a weight that pressed down on their hearts with every breath. They had done it. They had made the final wish, and the room was empty now. The twisted, hollow figure of their son was gone, and with it, the unbearable tension that had consumed them for hours. But something else had remained, a sense of loss deeper and more profound than any physical absence. The monkey's paw sat on the table, its gnarled fingers still, its power now seemingly drained. Mr. White stared at it. His gaze fixed his mind, a whirlwind of thoughts. He couldn't quiet. Had they truly made the right choice? Was this peace they had sought, or had they simply sealed their own fate with the third wish, the one meant to undo the horror of their son's return? He glanced at his wife, who stood by the window, her back to him. Mrs. White had not said a word since the figure disappeared. She was still and silent, her face pale, her hands trembling as she held herself steady against the cold, dark glass. The world outside was untouched by the grief that gripped them, serene, unchanging, but inside their world had shattered. Mr. White stood slowly, his legs feeling heavy, as though he was wading through water. He walked to the window, standing beside his wife, but neither of them spoke. He wanted to comfort her, to tell her it was over, that they could finally heal, but the words were stuck in his throat. There was no comfort now. Nothing could undo what they had done. The wind outside howled its mournful cry, cutting through the silence of the room. Mrs. White turned slowly, her face a mixture of exhaustion and regret. She looked at her husband, her eyes red and hollow, and in them he saw the depth of her sorrow, the same sorrow that filled his own heart. I thought I could bring him back," she whispered, her voice breaking as she spoke. "I thought if we wished hard enough, if we wished long enough, he would come back to us. But he didn't, did he? That wasn't our son. It wasn't him. Not really." Her words stung, but they were true. The creature that had appeared at the door, the thing that had looked like Herbert, was not the boy they had loved. It was something else, something twisted, something born from their own desires and mistakes. The second wish, the desperate hope to undo the horror, had not brought them peace. It had only opened the door to a deeper nightmare. Mr. White swallowed hard, the lump in his throat choking him. He could feel the weight of the decision he had made, the weight of his own guilt. He had gone along with it, convinced that they could bring back what was lost. But they hadn't. They hadn't understood the price. Not until it was too late. I should have listened to Morris. He muttered, his voice low, filled with regret. I should have known. The paw. It's cursed. It's never been meant to bring happiness. Only destruction. Mrs. White shook her head, her hands trembling at her sides. I don't care about that now. I just wanted him back, John. I couldn't bear to live with the emptiness. I couldn't stand it. There was a long silence between them. Neither spoke. There were no more words left to say. Only the weight of what they had done, the price they had paid, and the unspoken truth that hung between them like a shadow. And then, as if on cue, the clock in the corner of the room struck midnight. The sound echoed in the quiet house, marking the passage of time, but it felt out of place. Time seemed to have stopped. The world outside had moved on, but inside it felt as though they had been trapped in a moment, suspended between the past and the present. Mrs. White turned away from the window, her steps slow as she moved toward the door. She looked back at her husband, her face drawn, the lines of grief etched deeply into her features. I don't want to stay here anymore, she whispered. I can't stay in this house, not with the memories, not with what we've done. Mr. White didn't answer. He didn't know what to say. She was right. This house, this place that had once been a home, had become a tomb. The monkey's paw had left its mark on them, on their hearts, on their souls. And no wish, no matter how desperate, could undo the damage. He watched as she left the room, her steps fading into the distance. And then he turned to look at the paw again. It was still there, its twisted fingers cold and lifeless. But there was something about it that still held his gaze. Something that whispered to him from the depths of his mind. The desire to wish again, to fix what was broken, was still there. But he knew deep down that there was no fixing it. The paw had already taken its toll. It had claimed everything, and it would claim more if given the chance. He reached out and gently placed the paw in the drawer, locking it away, hiding it from view. It was the only thing left he could do. The house was silent now. There were no more knocks at the door, no more strange sounds or unexplainable events. There was only the stillness, the heavy, suffocating stillness that seemed to hang in the air. It was a silence that carried with it the weight of their regrets. White stood by the window, his heart heavy with sorrow, watching the darkness outside. There would be no more wishes, no more chances. He had learned the hard way that some things, some desires, should never be tampered with. And as the night stretched on, he felt the finality of it all. The monkey's paw had taken everything, and in the end it had given nothing but emptiness. The story of their wishes, their desires, and their mistakes would be carried with them forever. It was a lesson learned too late, a price paid in full. And the silence that had once been a comfort, would now be the only thing left. Part 7. The final lesson. The night passed slowly, as though the hours themselves had become heavy, each one pressing down like a stone on the heart. The house was dark now, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon. Outside, Mr. White sat at the table, his hands folded before him, his thoughts a whirlwind of sorrow and regret. The monkey's paw, once a symbol of hope and desire, was now nothing more than a memory locked away in the drawer. But its presence still lingered in the air like a shadow, a specter that could never truly be erased. He could still feel its power, its weight, even though it was hidden away. His mind kept returning to the final moments, the image of his wife's frantic plea as she had begged for Herbert to return, the desperation in her eyes, the unspoken belief that the wish could somehow fix everything. She had wanted him back so badly, wanted to undo the pain, the loss. But what had they gotten in return? A twisted version of what they had lost. And now, even that was gone. White could feel the emptiness inside him, a hollow place where once there had been joy, laughter and love. The house that had once been full of warmth and light now felt cold, empty like a graveyard of lost dreams. He stood up slowly, the heaviness of his heart pulling him toward the window. The world outside seemed unchanged, peaceful, serene. The village slept soundly, unaware of the grief and torment that had unfolded inside the walls of their home. It was as if time had continued on, without them leaving them, to drown in their own mistakes. Mrs. White had not returned to the room since the figure had disappeared. She had retreated into the bedroom where she lay, still unable to find peace. She had thought that the second wish would bring their son back to life. She had wanted him back no matter the cost. But now, as Mr. White gazed out into the night, he understood the lesson they had learned far too late. He knew in his heart that the true cost of their wishes was not the money they had received or the life they had hoped to restore. No, the true cost had been their souls, their peace of mind. The monkey's paw had not given them a gift. It had stolen from them piece by piece. Each wish had come with a price. Each wish had been a step further down a path they could never return from. In the silence of the house, Mr. White made a vow to himself. The paw was hidden now, its power extinguished by the final wish. But the lesson it had taught them would never be forgotten. The power to change, fate to wish for what one wanted most, was not a power to be taken lightly. Some things, some desires, were better left untouched, buried deep beneath the surface. He turned away from the window, the weight of his thoughts pressing heavily on him. He knew that there was no going back, no undoing the damage. They could not bring their son back, no matter how desperately they wished the price had been paid. And now there was nothing left but the quiet understanding that some forces were beyond their control. Mr. White walked to the drawer where the monkey's paw was locked away. He reached for it, feeling its cold surface against his fingertips. He held it in his hand once more, but this time it felt different. It felt empty. The power that had once pulsed through it was gone. and all that remained was a reminder of the cost of desire, of the consequences of unchecked wishes. As he stood there, holding the paw, he realized that it was not the paw that had cursed them. It was their own greed, their own longing for something that was not meant to be. The paw had merely been the tool. They had been the ones to use it. He placed the paw back in the drawer, locking it away once more. But as he did, he felt a strange sense of release. The weight of the past, of the choices they had made, seemed to lift just a little. It was a small step, but it was a step forward, away from the dark shadow that had hovered over them for so long. The house, still and silent, seemed to exhale with him, as though the air itself had been holding its breath. There was no more knocking, no more cries from the past. There was only the quiet, peaceful stillness of the night. And in that stillness, Mr. White understood. Some wishes, once made, cannot be undone. They can only be accepted and with time perhaps forgiven. But the cost is something that stays with you forever. He turned to leave the room, walking slowly down the hall toward the bedroom where his wife lay lost in her grief. He did not know what to say to her, how to comfort her. There were no words left, only the quiet, unspoken understanding that the past was gone, that Herbert was gone, and that in the end, some things were better left untouched. As he reached the door to the bedroom, he paused, taking a deep breath. He reached for the handle, his hand cold and stiff with the weight of the night, and then, with one last glance at the monkey's paw hidden away in the drawer, he opened the door. That brings us to the end of our story. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you again for future stories.